And speaking of the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, which we were just moments ago, our next guest has done some reporting on that subject as well. Ryan Grim is Washington Bureau Chief for The Intercept. He is an author. He is a political commentator for the Young Turks, and he is also part of a new publishing house entitled or named Strong Arm Press. It has a new book coming out on Betsy DeVos I'm looking forward to hearing more about. But first of all, Ryan, thanks for coming back on the program.
Yeah, thanks, RJ.
So let's talk a little bit about the DCCC and what's going on with them, particularly a lot of attention regarding its involvement or its insertion of itself into a Democratic primary in Texas. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
All right, so it's an interesting primary out in suburban Houston, kind of the wealthy suburbs on the western side. And you have kind of four major candidates who are in the race, kind of two that you could describe on the left and two kind of in the center. The two in the center, one is Alex. He calls himself Alex T because his last name is impossible to pronounce. So we're just going to go with Alex T. He's a former Goldman Sachs analyst who, is from the district, moved, went to New York, came back. When he came back, he got a job with a nonprofit as an immigration lawyer. In one of those moves where it kind of looks like you're setting yourself up for a political run, he has told people around the district that he was recruited by the DCCC to run in this race. Then there's Lizzie Panil Fletcher, who has the backing of Emily's List, and who many people in the district believe was also recruited by the DCCC. She has the distinction of being unendorsed by Texas labor unions. They need a certain amount in order to endorse a candidate, and because there are four, nobody could get it, but they all did come to a consensus that they would unendorse her. So they are working specifically against her because she is a corporate lawyer who is a partner in a union-busting law firm in Texas, and her firm has done some of the most aggressive cases that have worked to badly undermine labor in Texas. And they even boasted on their website that the way that they won their one major case against the SEIU was by going through potential jurors' Twitter feeds, trying to find Trump voters and try to stack the jury with Trump voters. And then on the left, you've got Jason Weston, who is a kind of a star cancer researcher at a hospital there that's one of the best cancer hospitals in the world, whose wife is a superstar OBGYN. And he's running on a very progressive platform, Medicare for all, and the whole litany of it. And then you also have Laura Moser, who kind of came to resistance fame in shortly after Trump's election when she created this kind of text messaging program called Daily Action, which you might remember. It allowed people who were frustrated to take a single action a day. Like here's who you need to call today to protect the Affordable Care Act. Here's a candidate running in a special election that you should give $5 to, or whatever. And that generated hundreds of thousands of users and activists. And so she moved back to Houston from Washington, where her husband was serving in the Obama administration, and she's also running. And the reason we're talking about this is that the DCCC last week unleashed an extremely unusual, not just for this cycle, but for the last several decades, kind of attack on a Democrat in a contested primary. Going so far, like the worst was the DCCC communications director retweeted somebody who called her an opportunistic grifter. That was kind of the most toxic that it got, but essentially they said she is kind of a corrupt, self-dealing carpetbagger who could never win the general election.
So we also have, according to your reporting, the piece you share a byline on in The Intercept, it quotes DCCC Communications Director Meredith Kelly telling the Texas Tribune voters in, Laura Moser's outright disgust for life in Texas. disqualifies her as a general election candidate and would rob voters of their opportunity to flip Texas's 7th in November. I mean, I'm not a Texan, Ryan, but them's fighting words.
Although, what's interesting is that they pulled that from an article she wrote for Washingtonian about the virtue of city life versus life in the countryside, city versus rural living. And she was talking about cost of living and job opportunities, et cetera. And so she used Paris, Texas, as an example of a place that she would not want to move back to. It's where her grandparents are from. And the irony for the DCCC to be saying, coming from Washington and saying this, Paris is about 300 miles away from Houston. And there's nobody who lives in Paris or who lives in Houston who confuses one for the other. And in fact, probably the majority of the people who live in suburban Houston have tons of disdain for Paris, Texas, and prefer to live in suburban Houston. And the feeling is mutual. A lot of the people who stay in Paris have nothing good to say about suburban Houston. And so it was just kind of amusing to see, for the DCCC, Texas is just one big red splat on the map. And if you've said one bad thing about a part of it, then you've said a bad thing about all of it. And also, let's not kid ourselves. I'm sure every staffer inside the DCCC has mocked Texas at one point or another.
Well, and it shows. But I'm also going to go out on a limb here. I didn't read the original comments from Laura Moser, but I'm going to go out on a crazy limb here and say that she probably did not say that she feels outright disgust for life in Paris, Texas. I'm going to guess she probably said it's not for her.
No, it was more colorful. She said she'd rather, she talked about the possibility of moving to Paris, Texas, where her grandparents had just sold a huge house for a very small amount of money. She's like, yes, I could move to Paris, Texas, but I'd rather pull my own teeth out without anesthesia.
Okay, that is outright disgust. Yeah. I stand corrected. That kind of outright disgust. Okay, gotcha.
That might even be higher than that.
Yeah, it might be revulsion. I don't know, but all right. But she's entitled to have her feelings about Paris, Texas, a place I have not visited. But your point is well taken about the potential hostility between Houstonians and residents of Paris. There are parts
regions, right?
There are parts of Houston that don't like each other.
I'm sure.
So okay. So just to quickly recap. So you have, we now have the case of the DCCC you said it had been a decade since they had mounted an attack this personal and this vicious. But stories that they had recruited this Alex Triantafyllis, which if he has money, I know from personal experiences that they do pursue candidates with money. You have Emily's List backing Lizzie Pinnell Fletcher, who the unions have, even though they're not endorsing, are like anti-endorsing. They're bizarro world endorsing. And they hate her and want her to lose. And Emily's List has been known, as you say, to work closely with DCCC. Although we know they sometimes put their fingers on the scale, but why would they get involved so viciously or so emphatically in a primary like this, and why would they kind of smear a candidate?
There are a lot of theories kicking around about why they would have done this. Part of it could be part of it could be that in June or July, Laura Moser wrote a column for Vice, not Vice, for Vogue. Going directly after Ben Ray Lujan, who's the head of the DCCC, making the case that he erred badly in the way that he handled the Heath Mello situation out in Nebraska, if you remember that, the Omaha mayor's race, where the party was getting behind somebody who had an anti-choice record, though had switched before they were running. And Ben Ray Lujan said, "Look, we're a big tent. We're open to candidates who are against reproductive freedom." And she wrote a column saying that he was wrong to do that. she hasn't really had much interaction with them since then. Another possibility, they just genuinely think she can't win and are trying to undercut her. The more cynical take is that the references to her consulting money, which was going to Revolution Messaging, her husband's company, where her husband's a partner in Bernie Sanders' firm, is not the kind of consulting firm that the DCCC usually recommends, because it's not stacked with former DCCC employees. And so part of the, there's some thinking that, well, the problem is that she's challenging their kind of hegemony when it comes to House campaigning around the country.
Well, the DCCC has a pretty bad record for winning elections, but it has a pretty good record for raising funds that go to friendly consulting groups. And I would agree with you that Revolution Messaging is not one of those groups. Let's talk about Emily's List for a second. Emily's List has the reputation, if a good, strong, progressive woman with a great record on reproductive rights is there, your Emily's List donation will go to helping that woman get elected. Yet, time and time again, I've seen Emily's List jump into races between two women where you think, if they have finite resources, and everybody has a limit on what they can spend, everybody runs out of money eventually, why would they spend it pitting one woman against another when there are so many other places in the country where women are running and would fight for reproductive rights? Here you've got someone in Laura Moser who I think has an extremely strong record on reproductive rights. They're putting their money behind a corporate candidate who's despised by unions, another core Democratic constituency, who is far to the right. When I was still out in Los Angeles, I saw them put money behind a conservative primary candidate there. What's the story with Emily's List? Did I misunderstand all these years what the purpose of Emily's List was?
So the general argument that Emily's List would make, and then I think is a totally plausible argument for why you would intervene in a race that has more than one woman, would be to say, if they don't, then the men, the women are going to split the vote among themselves, and without one of them pulling ahead early, then the men will move on to either to Congress or through a runoff. And so Emily's List has to get into these races and has to make difficult decisions in order to make sure that there's at least one woman that makes it through the runoff or possibly even wins outright. That requires, though, when you go down that road, an extraordinary amount of sophistication in figuring out who that particular woman is. And oftentimes that's not how the decision is made. And in this case, we know for a fact that Sherry Murfish, who is a major donor in Houston, a huge Democratic donor, worked for Emily's List for 20 years. Her husband owns a huge steel pipe company that has given lots and lots of money to Emily's List. She's a huge fan of Lizzie Pannell Fletcher. And so if it's a tough call for an organization, and if a donor from Houston has given millions to the party apparatus over the years, and specifically to Emily's List, then it raises the question of whether or not that right there is the reason that Emily's List made the endorsement for Fletcher. And you can see in Washington them sitting down like, okay, there's this race between these two women in Houston. One of them is backed by Sherry, who everybody that Emily's List knows, and knows that she's given an extraordinary amount of money to Emily's List. And they say, well, there's another woman in the race too, and she has a lot of small dollars, and she could win the race too. And so, yeah. On the other hand, Sherry really likes Lizzie Pannell Fletcher. And so you could see how the decision could come down to something as simple as that. And that's a problem with money in politics. But to your broader point, if of finite resources, you do have races around the country where you have a single pro-choice woman running against a single anti-choice man, and Emily's List is staying out of it. You've got Kara Eastman and Brad Ashford in Nebraska. For a long time, they were staying out of the Marie Newman, Daniel Lipinski race. They didn't think that was winnable. They're staying out of the Texas governor's race, which fits that. And there are some others around the country. So they are allowing some anti-choice men to skate by while spending money in these competitive races between two pro-choice women. And the irony in Texas is that there is a very good chance that the combined intervention of the DCCC and Emily's list here will lead next week to two men making it into the runoff on the Democratic side.
Well, that would be a shame. It's certainly self-defeating on their part. Well, Ryan, it's all very illuminating, especially about the role of money in politics. I don't suppose I'll surprise anybody if I say, you know, I'm very sympathetic to Laura Moser and what she's trying to do. But thanks for the great reporting, and thanks for coming on the program, Ryan Grim, Washington Bureau Chief of The Intercept. Always great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.